Now, of course, we've got an economist coming next, having just blasted the profession. Peter Kriesler is at the moment at the University of New South Wales, but he studied here before then, and he completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge. Now, work is your speciality.
It is.
And I'll throw to Peter.
Okay, well, having been, being an economist and coming after someone who's just blasted economists, I think I should start by confessing that I agree. I think economists have done more damage to the economy and society than any other profession except politicians who've listened to economists. And for reasons that I want to talk about. I want to talk about a measure that I believe will increase both fairness and prosperity, and that's to do with the question of employment. I think that Australia's record on employment since the 1970s has not been particularly good. It's been particularly bad, and I want to look at some of the reasons for that and look at the question of why employment is really important. The right to work is a fundamental human right. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which basically outlined the fundamental rights that all human beings should have, the right to a job was one of those key rights. If I can quote, it said, "Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection." Now, that right was reinforced by the International Covenant of Economics, Social and Cultural Rights, which was ratified by Australia and came into force in this country in March 1976. That covenant not only gave everyone the right to a job, but it also gave everyone the right to a job, which gave them remuneration, which gave everyone a decent standard of living. It also emphasised safe and healthy working conditions. In other words, the right is not only a right to a job, but a right to a decent job. In Australia, these rights were manifest in the White Paper of 1945, and that White Paper committed the government to the maintenance of full employment. It acknowledged that the right obligations of government with respect to the right of work imposed a responsibility on all governments to either directly create jobs or to give incentives to the private sector to do so. And in the immediate post-war period, this right was met by government expenditure on infrastructure. And that expenditure on infrastructure both led to full employment, it was fair and equitable, but also it led to great improvement in the standard of living of the general population. It's sad to say that the abandonment of the commitment to full employment first occurred in 1975 with Hayden's budget, which is often seen as marking the turning point away from Keynesianism and a concern with full employment to a much more conservative policy stance where governments no longer take responsibility. Instead, the number one goal of governments since 1975 have been fighting inflation first, and unemployment is almost an afterthought. It's not as important. And we're seeing that now with the emerging discussion of, will the Reserve Bank increase interest rates, governments worried about deficits and so on, which I'll come back a little bit in a little bit while. But I want to stress that the right to employment is a very basic right. Employment is not only a source of income. Employment defines a person's place in society. In many circumstances, in most circumstances, unemployment leads to social exclusion for the unemployed, and their family imposes costs on them and on society. And economic costs are only the very beginning. An economist, Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in 1968, said, if I may quote, "Unemployment is not merely a deficiency of income that can be made up through transfers by the state. It is also a source of far-reaching, debilitating effects on individual freedom, initiative and skills. Among its manifold effects, unemployment contributes to the social exclusion of some groups, and it leads to losses of self-reliance, self-confidence, and psychological and physical health." Implicit in Sen's discussion, I think, is probably the most insidious effect of unemployment, the decline of self-esteem. In our society, a person's public and private identity is shaped by their occupation. Usually the first thing you say when you meet someone is, "What do you do?" It's not you particularly care what that person does, it's that person's job defines their place in society. Without a job, they're no longer in society. So self-worth is driven by employment, and by the capability to provide for oneself and one's family. The costs that Sen lists include things like poor health, poor parenting, family breakdown and increased suicide rates, especially among younger unemployed males. Unemployment also imposes great costs on society, starting with the loss of output that those people who are unemployed would have produced, the loss of potential productivity, human capital, loss of skills, all the waste associated with jobless, as well as costs imposed by paying unemployment benefits, increased health costs, and increased criminal activity. We know there's a strong link between unemployment and crime, and that link usually comes from the children of the unemployed. And that's very important because unemployment tends to be intergenerational. And one of the serious problems is that the health and cohesion of society are seriously damaged when inherited unemployment creates an ongoing underclass. So this brings me to the really important question, I think, of why full employment has been abandoned. Why is it that we're more worried about a little bit of inflation than we're worried about unemployment? And the main reason, I think, is the perceived cost of unemployment. The perceived cost of full employment, sorry. Full employment is seen as being incompatible with low inflation. And as long as unemployment is seen as helping to reduce inflation, sustainable low unemployment will not be achieved. The single most important obstacle to achieving full employment in Australia or any other country is the belief held by orthodox economists, policymakers, central banks and the international financial community that we need unemployment to control inflation, coupled with the belief that deregulated labour markets will always get us back to full employment. However, as an economist, I'd like to stress that there is absolutely no economic theory that suggests either that full employment is the norm or that inflation is a problem in contemporary societies. The insight that capitalist economies have no mechanism to bring it to full employment and full employment is just a fluke was the main conclusion of Keynes's famous general theory of employment. And his policy analysis is still relevant today. Modern policy is usually guided by neoliberal or economic rationalist ideology. With respect to the labour market, the basic idea underlying it is that a deregulated labour market with no employment protection will allow the forces of supply and demand to establish a wage under which everybody who wants to will have a job. So basically, according to this view, if we just leave markets alone, everyone's okay and the government doesn't need to intervene. And this view is very important for a number of international institutions, such as the OECD, World Bank, International Monetary Fund. Of course, it was the ideology underlying work choices. If only we deregulate the labour market, everything will be in okay. The problem is that there's no economic theory and there's no empirical work that supports that. The OECD in particular, in the late 1980s and 1990s, really pushed the view that what Europe needed, what Australia needed, what a lot of countries needed was deregulated labour markets. They were criticised for exactly those reasons, for the reason that there's no theory behind it. So they said, okay, we'll stop saying it and we'll look at the evidence. From the late 1990s on, there is a huge turnaround, 360-degree turnaround from the OECD viewpoint. After looking at what actually happens, they concluded that we can no longer say that regulated labour markets, which include things like employment protection, guaranteed minimum incomes, all the packages that we associate with worker protection, they argued that there is no link between employment rights and improved economic performance. There's no link between employment rights and output or employment in general. The only link they could find is that if, in those countries that had employment rights, there is improved equity and fair outcomes. And in addition, they said that improved conditions and environments of social justice may actually make countries more productive because they increase labour productivity, they increase by increasing access to education, skills, and so on. So the first important point is that the argument that employment protection, making sure that people have decent jobs, comes at the cost of employment, is not borne out by any economic or empirical work. The second equally important observation is that of the cost of inflation. Everyone sort of seems to jump up and down and say, well, we really need to worry about inflation and we can sacrifice jobs in order to get inflation down. No one's explained why. In economic theory, inflation doesn't matter at all. Okay? Inflation imposes no costs on anyone. And in fact, one of the very great neoclassical neoliberal economists, a guy called Barrow, who wanted to show that inflation was a bad thing, looked at a whole lot of different countries and was only able to conclude that really high inflation may cause some problems, and really high inflation was inflation above 20%, somewhere near 50%. Below that, inflation doesn't impose a cost on the community. So the question really is, why don't we try and get back to full employment? And what policies should we use to try and achieve full employment? And the policies I think that we need to look at again is a heavy emphasis on fiscal policy. We should move away from having fiscal policy, which is government expenditure in particular on infrastructure, but also taxation. Move away from having it based on sound finance, in which we try to balance the budget and are overly concerned with the size of the budget deficit. The budget deficit doesn't matter as much as people think it does. A great economist once said that fiscal policy should be based on functional finance. And what he meant by that is that government expenditure and revenue should be determined so as to produce full employment with little inflation. We don't need to worry so much about the surplus or deficit. And given the current poor state of Australia's infrastructure, by all accounts, Australia's infrastructure is way below what it should be, there's a very strong case to be made that fiscal policy should try to fix this. So in this context, the current rhetoric of the Commonwealth Government is not helpful. In seeking to maintain a reputation as sound economic managers, our government suggests that in the longer run, it's got to follow a course of action that's counterproductive. It basically argues that unlike every other sector of the economy, governments shouldn't borrow to invest in assets which will provide more for the future. The government focus on repaying all the money it's borrowed up to now is likely to cut short any improvement in unemployment that Australia is going to reach. Now, I should also point out that unemployment currently, and we're hearing from the Reserve Bank that unemployment is too low, unemployment currently is 4.9%. That means approximately 1 in 20 people are jobless. However, that radically understates the true amount of unemployment. The definition of being employed is that you work 1 hour a week in a job or work for free in a family business. Okay? So anyone who works 1 hour a week is not classified as being unemployed. Now, clearly, we know that a lot of people who are working 1 hour a week or working very small numbers of hours want to work more. And this is particularly important because most jobs in the past few decades, most new jobs have been part-time or casual. Now, the Centre of Full Employment and Equity at the University of Newcastle has the wonderful name of Coffee, provides estimates for what it calls labour underutilisation, which is actually the unemployed plus those people who would like to work more hours and how many more hours it works. And these estimates show that the underemployment rate or labour underutilisation is usually about twice the unemployment rate. The last figures I could find were for November 2010, and for that quarter, labour underutilisation was 11.3%. So there's a lot more capacity in the labour market in the Australian economy than people believe. So we need expansionary policy, basically, is my conclusion, aimed at providing jobs. It's not pie in the sky. It was achieved in the past. In the first 30 years after the Second World War, Australians had the right to live in an economy that achieved full employment. That we should have that right again. There'll still be involuntary unemployment. Modern capitalism always throws up recessions through history, and that's unlikely to change. However, appropriate policies can make involuntary unemployment very short-lived. Anything else is a denial of a fundamental human right to hundreds of thousands of Australians. We should basically simply not accept unemployment.